much. It's a great honor to be invited here. The Institute is very well known in Tübingen, so it's great to be here. This is the talk is somehow part of the 300 years celebration of Kant's anniversary, as was the discussion yesterday on Kant in Croatia. And what I am going to do today is I'll be looking at the Kantian philosophy from a slightly different angle than it's usually done. So, according to the standard approach, Kant's philosophy is grounded on the subject's point of view insofar as the latter is taken to be universal. And this point of view is accessible from the first-person perspective. It's correlated with the capacities of understanding, sensibility, and the power of imagination. And these capacities, that's the standard view, provide the access conditions to both the sphere of object around us and to our own states. There is, however, a different theme running through Kant's critical philosophy. And when Kant elaborates on that theme, he focused from the very beginning on the interpersonal relation and therefore also on individual subjects. Kant refers to the attitudes, the modes of taking as valid, and is guided by questions of the following kind. How is it possible that I can link my mental states to claims to validity, which I take to be normatively relevant to other persons? Why is this the case in the first place, that my mental states are not exhaustively characterized by the way how they appear to me, but include content I can share with others? How is it possible that on these grounds we are in a position to understand each other? And in addition to this question, a further question comes to the mind. Which of my mental states, and accordingly which of the judgments expressing these states, do not entitle me to link them in a similar way to claims to validity? Now, we do have some evidence for the subject's interpersonal role in Kant's philosophy, but it's still not easy to determine how he intends to answer to these questions. And there are several reasons for that. One aspect of the difficulty can be traced back to the nature of judgments. So Kantian logic always classifies judgments as representations, Vorstellungen. That means something like mental representations. And mental entities seem to belong to individual subjects as their bearer. In addition, he claims that cognitive judgment refer to object through perceptions. And so it seems as if the content of perception would enter into the content of the corresponding judgments. But sensations are always a private matter, so they're only accessible to the first person, and it's not clear whether sensations can be shared at all. And if you go a further step to aesthetics, you will see that it seems even a bolder formulation. It seems as if the judgment of taste were grounded on a feeling, but feelings seem to be a paradigm of a merely private state. Now, in this paper, I will explore the underlying Kantian notion of communicability, and I will do so basically in 4 steps. In the 4 steps, I try to relate communicability to some of the core themes of Kant's theoretical philosophy, such as the theory of space, the theory of categories, and so on. In the second part, I discuss the issue to what extent it's possible to convey inner states. So how do we communicate about states of ourselves? In a third step, I will elaborate a little bit more on what Kant actually believes is object reference and what role it plays. And finally, in the fourth step, I will say a little bit more about what Kant means by communicability. So that's a very specific, slightly technical term, which differs from how we, after Frege and stuff, theorize about this type of topics. Good. Part number 1, that's about space, categories, and also about the role of object reference. So I first would like to remind you that the topic of communicability comes really in the foreground in the setting of aesthetics. It's peculiar for Kant's position that he argues that our aesthetic response, so our response to aesthetic value, is communicable, but he thereby does not mean that only this response is communicable. What's striking about aesthetics is that it's communicable even though it's not objectively valid. And and the argument on the justification somehow depends on the very fact that we are beings who also have cognitions, and through cognitions thereby refer to object as distinct from ourselves. So there is, in this type of setup, there is a certain type of asymmetry. So what he really is after in the critique of judgment is, so to speak, the communicability of the aesthetic response to the object. And this response can only be shared if we are human beings who also have cognitions, and within that cognitions we refer to object as distinct from ourselves. And this asymmetry actually, I think, is something which seems to be justified, because if we talk about aesthetics, the issue of what and how much I may expect from others when evaluating an object of aesthetic interest, that's a concern not just for philosophy, but already in everyday life. So, for example, in a discussion about the merit of a film I've seen, or a sculpture in front of us, there's often a skeptical doubt in the background. Do my claims really amount to more than a mere effort of persuasion? Is that really, am I really entitled to expect that someone else ought to share it? So that's an open question already in everyday life. And however, the issue in cognition is kind of different. We usually expect that we can share cognitive content and that the other should accept it if confronted with the right kind of evidence. So if people are skeptical about this question, it's usually only in a seminar on philosophy. So, for example, students may wonder, given Hume's, the role Hume assigns to mental representation, is he really in a position to explain shared mental content? So that's something we philosophers worry about, but usually everyday life persons don't worry about that. So that's why I think that Kant's basic strategy, you start with aesthetic evaluation and then trace that back to cognition as the underlying, less problematic case, seems to be a strategy which is okay and justified. Now, what I want to do today is focusing primarily on that area, or rather focusing on that area. So, as many of you know, there's a very complex argument which leads from aesthetics to cognition, and the critique of judgment dealing mostly very explicitly with that. So here we have the aesthetic response, to just give you a brief sketch, which is on the one side, it's a kind of expressed in a judgment. The judgment has as a predicate the predicate of beauty. In expressing the judgment, there is implied in that that there is a communicability of an underlying aesthetic feeling. So explicit content, beauty, implicit implication, the shared aesthetic response in feeling. That's a very unusual claim. Why should we share feeling? So that seems strange. And this feeling in turn responds to an internal relationship between the powers of cognition, especially here in a situation of free play, such that that is kind of mirrored, or that hints to this specific relationship. And that relationship is also involved, even though in a different mode, in the cognitive activity. And the cognitive activity is to be shared because it allows to refer to a common object. And if you have the common object, so to speak, you can draw an inference inside, then you know that the cognitive powers are to be shared, then you can expect that they are to be shared there, and this means that the response to the judgment is to be shared. So that's roughly the outline of what Kant is doing, and even though I tried to merge two talks today into one, I didn't fully succeed, and so I will mostly focusing on that bit. And that bit is kind of interesting because in the critique of judgment, Kant refers back to the critique of pure reason, but the parties referring to are not there. So he kind of was aware that he was talking about something that didn't quite exist. And to fill this gap, he sent a letter to one of his supporters, namely Beck, and he sent him a sketch and asked Beck to elaborate on this topic on Kant's behalf. So Beck was coming successively under the influence of Fichte and didn't do it. And so what I'm going to do today, I intend to do what Beck didn't do and fill the gap in the Kantian model or in the Kantian conception. That's roughly the outline of what I have in mind. So the fundamental relationship or the basis of where communicability comes from is to be found in the quotation number 1. There Kant writes, that's from the famous paragraph 9 of the Critique of Judgment, nothing, however, can be universally communicated except cognition and representation, insofar as it belongs to cognition. For only so far is the latter objective, and only thereby does it have a universal point of relation or reference with which everyone's faculty of representation is compelled to agree. So in the given context, the universality of the point of reference does not mean that we're dealing with an object as such in difference to particular objects. Rather, Kant refers to the fact that the object allows for an access from various perspectives on it. Thus, it is common to all potential cognizers which take up such a perspective. Thereby, in turn, the mental states of the subjects are transformed into a point of view on the object in the first place. Insofar as the mental states incorporate a perspective, my mental state can be tied to the expectations in respect of other persons because it becomes intelligible what it means that the others could take up my point of view on the object as well. So that's the basis or the starting point. So there are two aspects that are puzzling about this starting point. First, it seems as if Kant were arguing, so to speak, in the direction inside. That's what people call nowadays a self-directed transcendental argument. So it seems that he starts from the object reference and then he draws inference back to the cognitive capacities and then it goes on further to aesthetics. That seems precisely the other way around than what he does in the first critique. The second problem that might come to mind is whether this argument does not lead to a circular line of reasoning. The possibility that the other person could take up my perspective, or the other way around, seems already to imply that he can step in my shoes. It seems to imply that he could put himself in my position in the sense that he could actualize how things appear to me. But how is it possible, if my mental states are not communicable in the first place? For otherwise, my point of view would be inaccessible. Thus, it seems that within this framework, that seems to imply that there's a circular way of reasoning. And now for a first step, in order to gather the resources, we need to reject the objection. So we have to go back to the first critique. And in the first critique, one of the core strategic elements involved in object reference is space. It's by means of space that we represent an object as being outside of us. And so if we look at how he spells out space in detail, this suggests that we could read the basic term of the interpretation of Kant's position, a perspective, as a spatial term. So perspective is something that is a perspective in space. So it is determined by the way how an object presents itself in its geometrical structure of shape and position to a standpoint in space. And as perspective in that sense is not the same as a specific mental content or attitude that a person takes up within space. And since the latter is a subject of communicability, space is a tool to avoid circularity in that kind of reasoning. And if we look more detail, what Kant says it's about space, A3070, for example, is an example. He claims that space is in us, but that space in us does not mean that space is itself something mental, or that space is itself the structure of the visual field. For visual fields belong to individual perceivers, and immediately the question, is the visual field as I perceive it similar to the way you perceive, comes up immediately. And the question, could there be pathological cases so that some people see the space like that or so? And for Kant, he has a different approach. For him, the space is, so to speak, our criteria for distinguish the object from our own mental states as that which is at a different position. So in the famous arguments about the arguments about the status of space, he says so. It's by means of space that we somehow distinguish what's in us from what's outside of ourselves. At the same time, it's our tool, so to speak. It can't happen behind our back. And this implies that space cannot be something like a thing in itself. So space can't have itself, so to speak, a second backup. So there are different options. So you could imagine, so on the one sense you could say, here's space and there's a merely completely subjective way of perceiving it as it's different in all different perceivers. And then you would have something else, something like the objective space, which is completely outside. And Kant tries to avoid this kind of a firm distinction. For him, so to speak, space is a device I use to distinguish inner mental states from the outer objects that are represented, and thereby, so to speak, space is more than just my private mental state, but it shouldn't have, so to speak, a further backup, so to speak. That's my take on space, but then there's space in itself. Because if then we would have to have a further criteria, does our representation of space correspond to the actual space, and then we would have a regress resulting from it. And that's a bit at the point of what transcendental idealism here is about. Now, first step. Now, second step is I want to talk about on what grounds is that which fills space disclosed to us. So we go to the next layer. And the Kantian answer is, from a first personal point of view, what's real in space and time is given through intuitions. And the content of empirical intuitions always presents some kind of qualitative features for objects to us. And Kant calls these famously perceptions, that's Wahrnehmungen, and the sensations are that which corresponds to the real in the object. So perceptions and the sensations in them, they show us what the object are for us and how far they extend in a certain area of space. And however, if sensations play a crucial role in intuition, there is obviously a certain tension. For sensations are a bit what we nowadays call qualia, and Kant is very skeptical that they in any way have an intersubjective status. So there's evidence for that in the quotation number 2. I won't entirely read it, but he kind of seems to consider it conceivable that there could be persons who see the world kind of in brownish shades as in a copper plate engraving. So maybe one of you is among them, who knows? That's a possibility that he suggests. And the tension that results from that can be summarized as follows. Suppose intuition and thereby sensation play in irreducible way a role in how we access the sphere of objects from a first-person point of view. In addition, we are not in a position to defend the claim that the character of quality present in sensation transcends privacy. Furthermore, let us assume that Kant is still committed to the view that the reference to objects and the common object itself are the ultimate basis of a theory of communicability. The communicability to be explained is not the communicability of cognitions in general, but of particular cognitions, including empirical ones. Thus, the following question arises: what can be communicated in a judgment if its communicability is based on the reference to an object, but the properties of the object are accessible only via intuitions, and these intuitions include incommunicable sensations? So that's basically the problem. And it follows from the given problem that Kant's theory of communicability cannot be grounded on one place qualitative properties as they are present in our states of sensation. So Kant has to choose an alternative options. He focuses on compositional and relational features of the object instead. The framework of these compositional and relational features has to be applicable to the objects which also have qualitative features, but the framework must also be invariant in respect of these features. So Kant can't help introducing a conception into theoretical philosophy that bears important similarities to claims he also endorses in aesthetics. For in aesthetics too, the corresponding claims are quite prominent. In aesthetic evaluation, we do not rely on the specific character of sensations, but only on the form of the object. You find that in quotation number 3, where he says, in painting and sculpture, indeed in all pictorial arts, in architecture and horticulture, and so far as I find out, the drawing is what is essential, in which what constitutes the ground of all arrangement for taste is not what gratifies in sensation, but merely what pleases through form. So there he had kind of developed this idea of form to kind of avoid that qualitative properties enter into what is meant to be shared. And in theoretical philosophy, he basically does the same. And so that's how he approaches the situation. The difference, however, that the relational and compositional features in cognition must somehow be necessary features. The elementary relations are not only independent from particular qualia, but there must be some kind of rational import in them. Now, a further step is needed in order to complete the first outline to Kant's approach to communicability of cognitions. According to Kant, composition and relation are not part of what can be immediately given to us. That's a core Kantian claim. It's actually controversial. I often get critical response when I read this passage and they want more justification. For Kant, composition and relation is present only insofar as we delineate them. Once we run through that material, so to speak, we have to draw the connection in order to make them accessible for us in the first place. And that corresponds to the role of the spontaneous capacity of the mind, which is here in the background. And the background is obviously the active role of understanding and the active role of imagination. That means for the overall setup, if the mind were not spontaneous, there were no communicability in Kantian theory. So that's a very important claim here in the background. And if we now look at as a long quotation from called number 4, that's from the sketch that Kant sent to Johann Sigismund Beck to make him explain what he's after. And so you find that there's a corresponding line of reasoning. Kant starts with the reference to the object and the communicability grounded on it. That's in passage number 4. Could you also make clear what you mean by the word Beilegung in Latin? And then he starts. Furthermore, one cannot actually say that a representation befits another thing, but only that if it is to be cognition, a relation to something else befits a representation whereby it becomes communicable to other people. For otherwise it would belong merely to feeling or pleasure of displeasure, which in itself cannot be communicated. So here you see object reference is a core, and the way that representation represents the object is a core, what he actually thinks. And then he moves on to the underlying idea of activity of composition and relation. He says, but we can only understand and communicate to others what we ourselves can produce. So that's a core claim. It seems to be more straightforward about understanding. So understanding means composing. But here, and it's also a condition for the communicability. And number 2, he goes on, the composition itself is not given. We must produce it ourselves. We must compose if we are to represent anything as composed. So that's the story Kant wants to tell us. And you see that there's some correspondence to Kant's theoretical philosophy, but the aim, what he's arguing for, is different, or is certainly different, and also the direction of how he argues is different as well. And there's one aspect in the background I would like to you to bear in mind. It seems also that he picks up the idea of synthesis and synthetic activity from Kant, but the framework kind of has shifted, because in here the synthesis is a condition that mental content can be shared, and that relates to general consciousness. But in the deduction section of the first critique, it's really about the mental states being mine. There's a question of the identity of the self involved, and general consciousness doesn't have an identity. Only individual consciousness has an identity. So there are so in the shift to the critique of judgments, there are two different notions of the underlying self. One notion of the self is some kind of a general self. So if you entertain a thought, we are really all united as one in that. Whereas the argument in the deduction section goes really about a self which has an identity, and this identity runs through a number of different states. So that's an important difference. Good. So that was a kind of laying ground to the story Kant wants to tell. And I'm going in the next 2 parts, which are much shorter, I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that. And then I go, finally we'll reach some reasoning about the underlying notion of communicability itself. So in the second part I will focus still on the communicability of cognitions, and one may wonder whether the role of object reference is has not been too much emphasized. What about the communicability of inner states? What about the communicability of states of inner sense? And you can also ask this kind of question if you say, on the one hand, I have been talking about object reference as the basis. Objects are distinct from our mental states. On the other hand, I have been talking about synthetic activity, which is invariant in respect of qualitative features. How closely are they related? What about situations of inner sense? And as Michael Wolff has observed, inner sense does not present us with objects, but certainly it does include relations. For example, if you look at the quotation number 3 at the end, he talks about the mere play of sensations in time. So Kant uses this passage to distinguish different forms of art. Sculpture, painting, dance, and those which are mere play of sensations in time is music. So when Kant talks about music, he doesn't talk about, so to speak, sounds or noises which can be measured externally, but he seems to assume that where music really happens are the sensations, so to speak, on the inside. And now he certainly does seem to assume that we can share our aesthetic response to music. And so we have to have a thought about what happens to our representations of inner sense. And could there be, so to speak, inner relations which are sufficient to convey what states we are in? And the possibility that that actually happens is undermined if we look a little bit at the architecture of the different senses and the critique of pure reason. There are two pieces. I won't discuss them in detail, but I would like to mention them. One is the so-called refutation of idealism in the critique of pure reason. So there Kant says that what happens in inner sense is only has only the certain structure it has if we have also object reference. So it's impossible to cut apart and to have, like Descartes seems to be possible, that we have only the inner realm. But if there's access to inner realm which is structured as we believe it's structured, in particular temporally, there must also be a relation to outer objects. That's one important claim, so there must always be a relation to outer object that's also in place. And the second claim he's arguing is that he says ultimately all matter comes from the outside. So all cognitively relevant matter comes from the outside. So what enters the material, even of inner sense, is material that comes from the outer sense. Well, people don't like that claim too much. What about my melancholy and stuff? Things come from me, and so I can experience it, but that's not primarily a cognitively relevant state. And on that ground, on the ground of these two assumptions, kind of, the Kantian idea is that he can talk about inner states to talk about outer states. Thereby, he does not mean that in the inner we have a separate type of objects, so to speak, inner sensations. You know, these inner little figures we have in our mind, and they're kind of painted red. They're not that type of inner sensations we're painted red, and if we make a judgment of perception where we talk about the unite inner states, we don't talk about these individual inner happenings, but what really happens is we have a judgment that talks about the outer objects, and in respect of this talk we refer it back to ourselves. You can see that at the quotation number 5, where he says, a judgment from mere perception is really not possible, except through the fact that I express my representation as perception. I who perceive a tower perceives in it the red color, but I cannot say it is red. So it's not that there's a different type of entities, outer entities and inner entities, but there's one reference outside, and I can, so to speak, assign it to me. So I have an activity of assigning it to me, and that changes the status of validity. And now the question that comes out of this debate is, does that then mean that we can communicate our inner states in a similar way than we can communicate the outer states? And here, the Kantian answer is somehow no. So suppose you have a claim about an outer object, so this tower is red or so. You can expect that someone else ought to share this judgment given the suitable circumstances, but it's not clear on what ground he has reached that judgment. For example, he can just have this inner impression of redness and then he goes straightforwardly for that judgment. He may have kind of problems with color perception and then relate to some theory about what the object must be, given certain circumstances. Then he arrives at the same judgment, but from a completely different way. And we have no expectation from which way he actually reached the judgment. And so there's no expectation of how things have seemed to him in the first place. So you can expect him to know what the object is like. But you can't expect to him what it seems to have, this impression of the object. However, Kant must somehow claim that we can talk about how it seems, because we right now just do it. But this means he must have some kind of a two-layer theory. The basic layer is about where we talk about real objects outside. And the second dependent layer is we talk about how things seems to us. And the way how things seems to us depends on the underlying objective notion, but it's kind of less strong than the original idea of communicability. So their two-layer approach, so we can convey inner states, but we don't thereby communicate them in the Kantian sense. And conveying them is possible if we can communicate the underlying layer in the first place. So here again we see that Kant argues rather from outside to inside than the other way around. Good. So, part number 3, I will briefly refer to some passages, or I briefly explain a little bit more about how we actually refer to objects and what role that plays in communicability. So, one could be worried about the following. Certainly, if I synthesize the visual field I have in front of me and I correlate it and place the relations in there, that's a mental activity. But doesn't that correspond to the fact that what I synthesize is mental as well? So isn't there some kind of the implication that appearances are ultimately mental stuff? Yeah? So that's a question that is involved here. And if so, obviously there's a problem of circularity. You would have to have a shared response in the first place to derive at what the object is. And I think that Kant again can respond to these challenges. First, he can rely on the deduction argument, which proves that all cognizers have to perform a synthesis and relate things in the same way. Secondly, he can argue that the fact that we use mental activity to synthesize doesn't mean that that which we take together is mental as well. So that doesn't follow in his reasoning. And if we look in detail, we see the more Kant is moving in the direction of the critique of judgment, the more, so to speak, objectivity appears in the way how he presents things. So if you look at the A version of the critique of pure reason, he always says like the object is a representation. That seems kind of like Berkeley style philosophy. What he means thereby that the object is the content of a representation if the representation is successful. However, he got all this critique and he was dissatisfied with this formulation, and you can see it in the quotation number 6. I won't read it out entirely. There he kind of goes to a more objective reading where he says the object is that which stands over against the cognition as corresponding to it. So we have here, so to speak, the kind of representational states, and the object is that which stands over against that in order to allow for a representation. However, this still looks like as if it were, so to speak, an empty X, and all possible content still comes from the representation. It's only a variable to kind of assign the content to it. But that seems still to be open to some kind of misunderstanding. So he writes, as you know, in quotation number 4, we cannot say that a representation befits another thing, but only that it has a relation to something else. So he wants to make very clear, but even if that's a position and there's all content, it doesn't mean that we ascribe representations to the object. It means, so to speak, that representations refer to the object, and thereby we do make an additional assumption, so to speak, that namely the assumption that through the synthetic ordering, the mental content is kind of objectified as a property of the object. And this object, which has properties different from the mental representation of it, only that object can be a basis of communicability. So that's roughly how he develops and elaborates that. The more Kant goes into the critique of judgment and the corresponding readings, and already in the step from the A version of the critique to the B version, the more, so to speak, of objectivity is there in the notion of an object, and only if there is, so to speak, his idea of communicability can get off the ground. So if you want to describe that in a little bit more modern terms, you can say somehow something like it's a kind of combination of idealism and externalism. So there's some kind of an externalism where the object is responsible for the shared mental content, but the overall framework is kind of an idealist framework. And that's not too bad after all, because the realist externalists such as Donald Davidson, one of my teachers, they always have the problem to explain how we can know our mental content if it's so objective. And that's not really a problem in the Kantian position, because the externalism is framed from the very beginning in some kind of an idealist conception. And you will see here that a theory, an element of the theory we encountered already in space is present here as well. So we use, for example, the idea of knowfulness to distinguish the object and its properties from us. This very criteria we use to distinguish them, they're somehow ours, and that's what makes it roughly an idealist conception. And in respect of these criteria, we shouldn't ask once again, what is the realist backup? Are the criteria the right ones? Shouldn't we look that reality is actually causal as our category of causality suggests? If we do that, we have to have other criteria how to relate that, and then we have to have criteria how to relate that, and we come immediately in a regress. So that's kind of the background assumption on how this model is meant to work. Good. I'll have a brief moment left, as I now want to explain a little bit more about the concept of communicability. So that's the last part. We have been talking a lot about the overall concept of communicability and its different features. Let's see where I see. I mean, it's important to know in the background somehow the idea that to be communicable does not mean to convey to another person that I'm in a certain state, but it's about expecting that if he's in the suitable conditions, he should be in a similar state. So the basic notion is not something like where you have the notion of expression as the most fundamental notion, but you have the notion of expectation as the most fundamental notion. You expect of someone else, if he is in a similar position, to have the corresponding state. And there are kind of different aspects related to that. One aspect is communicability is not the same as subjective universality. That's a term that also plays a role in the critique of judgment. But the relationship is more complex. Subjective universal validity, that's the validity someone else ought to share, is part of what it means to be communicable. But it's not identical with it. So it's a subgroup within the overall setting of what is communicable. And there are several reasons or arguments for that. Bear in mind, for example, if you look at quotation number 7, that's again from the Critique of Judgment, I think paragraph 21. Cognition and judgment must, together with the conviction that accompanies them, be able to be universally communicated. So there are different elements. It's cognition, and this involves judgment plus the conviction. And the conviction is the taking as true, the taking as valid. And you need to have an idea about how these two things are involved. So, in a certain way, you can't say something like, first, there's a merely private inner state, and then I relate it to validity and everyone else shares it. Because you can only relate it to validity if already is a state which subset allows to be tied to validity. If it would be merely private states, you couldn't tie it to validity in the first place. Second argument is somehow Kant seems to suggest in some passages from the anthropology and notes from the anthropology that we can communicate fictions. Fictions are states where we know that they're not tied to validity in the first place. And thirdly, Kant says something very explicitly about the possibility of conveying aesthetic feelings. Now, feelings in Kant are receptive states. So they're not like judgments. I don't undertake them directly. So you can't just say, I feel, and then you actualize it. It's happening within you, but you do not directly undertake them. and you can form a judgment about feelings, and that is something you endorse. But you cannot just endorse a feeling itself, because it's not a judgment. And since the aesthetic feeling is a receptive state and it's communicable, and only judgments tied directly to validity being shared must be a broader notion than just sharing validity in the first place. And giving this background, we get some kind of an idea what he means by communicability. As I said, it's not about the possibility of conveying that I'm in a certain state of sensation or judgment. It is about the fact that I'm entitled to expect someone else to share it, and that is the first order state in question. It's communicable if we are entitled to expect of another person to have a token of a cognitive or evaluative state of the some type. We have given the following condition. The other follows my summons to take up my perspective in a suitable circumstance. Here in bracket you see that Fichte's idea of summons really comes from the critique of judgment. The critique of judgment, where you summon someone else to free spontaneous activity, was one of the first pieces from Kant Fichte has read. And so here's a close link to that. And of course we have to introduce in the idea of circulable circumstances that the other person is attentive to the object and that it fulfills the demands to actualize the inherent tendencies of his cognitive capacities. There's some teleological idea of the mind involved. Capacities have goals, have tendencies and directions. And thirdly, that he uses either directly or indirectly his own powers of judgment, whereby the latter implies both the understanding and imagination. And fourthly, that's now an addition that's not so clear in Kant, we must always have had some actual successful cognitions of the outside world. So, you know, he argues, if you imagine the picture at the very beginning, we have an object reference and we have cognitions and we draw an inference to our cognitive powers and stuff. If we never had actual or successful cognition, we probably would never get into the inside argument in the first place. And finally, I would like to address an issue which has been a lot of debate about critique of judgment. I said we expect from another person to be in a similar state. And as you know, expecting can have either a normative or a prognostic meaning. So expect what will happen or expect what ought to happen. And there are different readings of that. The Kantian terms in German are ansinnen and zumuten. Nobody knows them anymore because they're not used in that way. And for example, Paul Geyer and Miles Rind have completely different interpretation. Paul Geyer thinks it's to impute or attribute, which seems to correspond to the prognostic meaning. And Miles Rind said it's regard as due. And regard as due has a kind of a normative meaning. And so the basic text which is at the ground of that debate, that's the last text we have on our handout. And that's now from the Critique of Pure Reason. It's the core passage where he mentions the issue of communicability. That's from meaning Glauben, Meinen und Wissen. And he writes there, persuasion is a mere semblance, since the ground of the judgment which lies solely in the subject is held to be objective. Hence such a judgment always has only private validity, and this taking something to be true cannot be communicated. Now, the touchstone, I leave a sentence, the touchstone of whether taking something to be true is conviction or mere persuasion. It therefore externally, the possibility of communicating it and finding it to be valid for the reason of every human being to take it to be true. For in that case there is at least a presumption that the ground of the agreement of all judgment, regardless of the difference among the subjects, rests on a common ground, namely the object. And now the question is, how do we understand, how do we correlate the text? Usually we tend to think that Miles Rind regarding as due interpretation is closer to Kant, but if we look more closely we find out that that may actually not be true. Why not? First, being communicable cannot be identified with the demand implied in my taking a judgment to be true. but it's not simply the very demand plus the fact that I'm entitled to the demand. Rather, it's a criterion for whether I'm entitled to that demand. And therefore, it is conceptually distinct, both from demanding and a state of entitlement to demand. And this can be articulated in the following way. The former is, so to speak, the input, and the latter is the result of a testing procedure. And the testing procedure operates by means of communicability. I'm performing a thought experiment. I check whether my demand is communicable. Since we're dealing with our taking as true, what matters in the experiment is that everything else agrees to it and therefore will share it with me in suitable circumstances. Note that in the procedure of the experiment itself, there is and has to be a non-normative element. It's about what everyone will share, not what he is expected to normatively share, because that's what's tested in that idea. And now, however, I kind of water down this a little bit, because Kant says it's true for the reason of every human being. And be reasonable is certainly something that I may demand of someone. And in that sense, there's a kind of mixture of a theoretical and a normative element involved in here. Good, so that was a tour de force, and I just kind of briefly summarize. You see, there is a large interpersonal agenda in Kantian philosophy. It's centered about the idea of communicability. It's just not just about taking as true, even though that's the most important thing for Kant, but it's also about sharing aesthetic feelings. So it's deeply grounded in the idea of what we as human beings are. It's depending on the fact that we're human beings who also have feelings. It's dependent on the idea that we're human beings who also have a spontaneous mind. So it's not just a matter of abstraction or a matter of logic and so on. And you thereby can bridge somehow the relation between aesthetic and cognition. So it's not like in Frege, who has the idea of shared mental content and thinks that everything aesthetic is just private mental theater, but he can bridge the relation between both, and thereby offers a rich conception of intersubjective agenda. And this ultimately has to do with the idea that as cognizing being, we refer to objects as distinct from our mental state. So thank you very much for your patience.